And now, the lowdown with economist and political strategist Elson Low.
Good night, folks. Good night. Welcome to the lowdown. Welcome to the lowdown. It's always good to be here with you. It's always a fun time. We talk about interesting things. We get a better sense of what's going on in the Guyanese economy, how viewers can position themselves, what they can learn from what's going on. So it's always good to be on. It's always good to be here on the lowdown. It is a Tuesday night, and we want to say thank you for starting your Tuesday on a high with your host, Elson Low. So it's good to be on. Share the link, folks. Let's give everyone an opportunity to see the show. Let's bring everyone on. So share the link. I'm your host, Elson Low, and I'm happy to be here chatting with you. Folks, we've got some interesting things to talk about tonight. We're going to talk a bit about some of the things that we mentioned in the press conference today. As I indicated, everyone in Guyana needs to know about oil the way that we knew about sugar, the way that we knew about bauxite. This has already come to dominate the Guyanese economy, with about 60% of Guyana's exports being oil already. So, folks, we've got to get to know the oil and gas economy. We've got to get to know the impact of the oil and gas economy. And Guyanese need to always keep an eye on that industry. So we're going to talk a bit about the press conference where we made some statements today regarding the oil and gas industry. We're going to talk a bit about some concerning events in the oil and gas industry here. We're going to also talk a bit about, actually, we're going to go over a particular country which has, I think, yields several good insights for what is going on in Guyana, or gives some perspective as to what is going on in Guyana, and that is Angola. So we're going to have a video, and we're going to break up into parts, which goes over quite a bit about Angola, and you'll see that there are, unfortunately, several similarities between Angola and Guyana, and several things as a result to watch out for. So we'll go over that. We'll take a look at that, and that will hopefully give you some further perspective as to how you can position yourself as to what the changes to the economy will be, as to how Guyana is transforming, and what are the things that we should be optimistic about, and the things, on the other hand, that we should be concerned about. So we're going to talk a bit about that. We're going to talk a bit about the cost of living situation. Got to talk about cost of living because it continues to be a real bane of Guyanese. Continues to be a real bane. We're also going to talk a bit about, partially to set up the video on what's going on in Angola. What has been going on in Angola. We're going to talk a bit more about real estate market in Guyana, how that has been affected, some of the changes. Some people have expressed surprise and dismay at the vast changes to the real estate market, which is, I think, very understandable. But we're going to talk about that and give you a sense of what is going on. We've mentioned some of this in the past, but hopefully we can make this even more concrete by chatting a bit about the relationship between what we see in Guyana and what you can see in other oil and gas economies that are very similar to Guyana. Maybe they're larger in terms of the population, but in terms of the production and so on, relatively similar. So we're going to talk, as a result of that, a little bit about Angola, which is a country in Western Africa, former Portuguese colony. Of course, Guyana is most known as a former British colony, so slightly different in that regard, but many similarities. Angola being right across the Atlantic. Folks, share the link. Let's give everyone a chance to see the show tonight. Let's bring everyone in. Share that link. Let's get everyone in. It's going to be an interesting show tonight. We're going to talk about the press conference. We're going to talk a bit about cost of living. We're going to talk a bit about the real estate market. And we're going to talk about Angola and use that as a lens to help you to get a sense of what is going on. Folks, this is issues in the news, the lowdown issues in the news. And some of the issues that we're going to talk about really tie in well with what we're going to look at regarding the video in from Angola. So share the link, share the link. Let's bring everyone in, folks. Let's bring everyone in. It's good to have you here on the Lowdown. I am your host, Elson Low, and let's get rolling. So first, we're gonna bring up. We would love to have our memes of the week here on the Lowdown. So we're gonna bring up our first meme, our first slide, and that should give you viewers a little bit of a laugh. So essentially, here we've got someone saying that egg was 880 a tray, and now it is 1800 a tray. But in some places, it's 1900 or 2000. So egg is more than doubled. Goodness, and kerosene is another thing that they're mentioning is reached a ridiculous price. Um, I think this is really does I think symbolize a lot of the issues that we've been having with the cost of living, especially in regard to food. Food is one of the things where you can't really get away from it as someone living in Guyana. Everybody has to eat, really. And many of the things that people who are sometimes on the low end of the income scale, but even average Guyanese consume, the prices have gone right through the roof. We have fortunately seen some cooling off of various prices in the international market. That's true. We see a little bit of that. But as we've mentioned before, there are real concerns as we head into the latter parts of the year. There are real concerns about the direction that things will go because of the looming additional sanctions on Russian oil. So that's a really big question that's lingering in the environment. However, in the short run, we've still got to deal with prices that are very elevated and wages that are relatively stagnant in the economy. We've not seen a public servant increase, early in the year. We've called for at least a 10% increase now, and then later on we can see about an additional increase by the end of the year to help to alleviate some of these cost of living woes that we're seeing in Guyana. And of course, we'll remind you, viewers, that the last supplemental budget that was passed had almost nothing for cost of living within it, almost nothing. Whereas, really, we need to see serious efforts to deal with the cost of living issue in the country. We need to see that. It is not acceptable. It has not been acceptable. It will never be acceptable. That Guyana is the fastest growing country in the entire world, the fastest growing country. And yet people are out here punishing and finding it difficult to make ends meet and struggling with costs that have doubled in some cases. That is never going to be acceptable, and the government needs to take a great action. But in not taking an action, first of all, nothing substantial, less than 1% of the annual budget, that's the original amount. And then, second of all, when you look at the supplemental, because supplemental budgets are supposed to deal with unforeseen circumstances. What are the unforeseen circumstances that were dealt with? Some money for guys to go, some money for housing, and so on. Well, yes, housing is important. It's not unforeseen, if you understand as viewers. What's unforeseen is the crisis in Ukraine and the effect on the cost of living. That was unforeseen. And therefore, the efforts, the funds, the budget should have been focused around that issue. That is what a supplemental budget is really for. It is not for putting in things that could easily have been put into the original budget for the year. These things could easily have been put into the original budget for the year. But rather, viewers, we've seen the PUP just totally ignore the cost of living issue in the last supplemental, or almost completely ignore it. And as a result, people are really going to have to continue to face a lot of pain over the course of the rest of the year, knowing at the back of their mind that there's a real concern that you may see an escalation of cost of living woes as additional sanctions kick in on Russia. Now, in addition, that is one part of it, but it's also mentioned kerosene there. Was mentioned in the previous post, the post that we looked at, the meme of the week. That actually is a concern for those of lower incomes because they use kerosene stoves, of course, and kerosene prices have gone up just like every other gas and associated price. We have said that we need to bring down and keep down the price of gasoline and those types of items such as kerosene and so on. Of course, we've seen prices come off a bit, but we believe that those prices should not be allowed to go beyond a certain level. And even in Barbados, which is by no means an oil producer, you're seeing a gas price cap. You're seeing a cap there. So as much as the PVP might want to say that this doesn't make any sense, it can't be done, etc., we've seen Barbados, which is a country that they've had extensive diplomatic relations with lately, doing that. So clearly it can be done. Clearly it can be done. So that is a really a key area, something that must be a focus for the government going forward. That must be a focus so long as the cost of living crisis persists. No one anticipated that with the advent of oil, we're going to see such difficult cost of living situation, or at least many people were not talking about it. We must not let the changes to our economy result in lower standards of living. We must not let that happen. And we're actually going to, in the course of the video about Angola tonight, we're going to look at some of the similar trends that you can see in the development of Angola that are, I think, creating real concern, that are so similar to Ghana that they could create quite a bit of concern, I think reasonable concern. So we're going to have a look at that, and hopefully that will yield some insights that can help you to also have your perspective on how we should deal with the changes that are happening in our economy. So we're going to touch on that in a little bit. Let's get the next slide up here. So we've seen, and this is something we mentioned in the last show, but it's something we mentioned actually in our press conference. We've seen the auction of the oil blocks be delayed. And we're hearing that it is delayed, first of all, because they want to get better terms. And then we're seeing that it's delayed for various other flimsy, really, reasons. But the core thing that I think raises alarm about this is uh, we also saw earlier this year a national oil company idea scrapped because it would cause, at least this is what it was said, a slowdown in the drilling for oil, a slowdown in the actual prospecting for oil, and therefore slowdown in the oil industry. So that's what you're seeing on the one hand, and then all of a sudden you're also seeing that there is now a slowdown in the auction of the oil blocks. So the question is, if you scrap the national oil company idea to ensure that you could get this oil block auction and so on done as quickly as possible, why are you now pushing back the same oil block auction? That's a big contradiction, a huge contradiction. And it's that contradiction we've seen quite a bit with the PVP. We saw them say that before the 2015 election that they would renegotiate the cyber block PSA. Then after they got into government, they refused to renegotiate the PSA and they said they're not going to do that. So that's, first of all, very contradictory opinions. But then even recently, we've seen them say that in the future they'll renegotiate the cyber block PSA. And then, just a few days later, the president now come out and say that that is not what was said. So there seems to be something going off here in terms of what exactly is being said, who exactly is making these decisions, what exactly the PVP's policies are. That seems to be very, very unclear. And that, of course, is not acceptable because in the oil and gas industry, you're talking about tens of billions of US. So you cannot afford to not be particularly clear on something. That is the last thing that you want to be. But that is really what's going on. It's a lot of contradictions you're seeing, a lot of contradictions, and it raises serious questions. Now, we also mentioned that we believe that there should be no oil block auction without further measures for transparency and accountability and an investigation into Sue's allegations that he had bribed Jagdeo for an oil block. Now, that is especially disturbing because if you have an oil block auction coming up and someone like Sue is saying that they already paid a bigger bribe is the way he framed it, it means that he is it could be saying if what he is saying is true. Of course, we don't know if it's true. That's why we're calling for an investigation. But if it is true, it could be that he has already got his oil block locked off and the auction itself will be a sham. That is the implication if his statements are true. This is why we need to see an investigation, folks. We need to see an investigation. Now, you may say, oh, what does it matter? At the end of the day, there'll be oil production. But one key thing to note is this: not investigating these issues, not investigating these issues, that actually deters investors because they're thinking to themselves, you have a very serious allegation around the oil industry, and you're not seeing any action on it, which may mean that the government is not particularly bothered with it or even condones. Now, we need to see an investigation to find out the truth. We need the government to act on its promise. Remember, it has promised this to clear up, therefore, any of these concerns. It has promised that it will investigate this issue. You've not seen any particular moves in that direction. So, oil companies that don't want to involve themselves in these types of potentially in these types of shady activities, they may want to step back from the auction. They may want to step back from the auction. And so instead of you getting, let's say, a 10% royalty, just to call a number, you might only get an 8% royalty. Because the people who are willing to pay 10% may not be willing to engage in this type of situation or to put themselves at risk, whether it is to have to pay a bribe, whether it is to be to put their reputation at stake by dealing with officials where there are allegations, serious allegations that have not been investigated, that need to be investigated so we find out the truth. So that may cost you a couple percentage just in your royalty right there. Now, what does that mean in terms of loss to the country? That means hundreds of millions of US that could easily be lost in terms of the value that we get from the upcoming oil block auction. Hundreds of millions of US. What does that mean for you as citizens? That could easily fund a power plant, a solar power plant, that would produce more electricity than the Amalia Falls hydro plant is expected to produce. So that is one way that we can see more stable electricity supply as well as cheaper electricity because, of course, solar is incredibly cheap. So it is really, really annoying and concerning and worrying that we've not seen any motion regarding more transparency and accountability with the auction of these oil blocks and regarding the investigations of the allegations that Sue has made, because that may actually be turning off investors and directly impacting the quality of life, the experience that you have in Guyana. Now, there is no need for us to be having blackouts nonstop. But if you're going to be turning off investors, if you're not going to be dealing with allegations of corruption, then you can understand why we can't get a lot of these basic things to function the way that they should function. And if you say, oh, well, this is all looking at the future, you can't really make a judgment about electricity today. But recall, viewers, that Sue has also said that a big bribe was paid, this is his allegation, regarding the hydroelectric dam, which is Amalia Falls. That has been in the works for over 10 years, for about 10 years. And so, from that perspective, you can very much tie the fact that we don't have reliable and cheap electricity, very much tie it to the allegation that someone in particular, a bald-headed man who wears glasses, further I say not, has been taking bribes this entire time. That's the concern. That is the concern. And so it is not some abstract idea we're talking about, oh, corruption is bad, this. It is having, or could, allegations are that it is having a direct, serious effect on the Guyanese economy and Guyanese standards of living. A direct and serious effect. So this is really an issue that needs to be dealt with. That's why we're raising it again. That's why we're raising it again. But the other thing that is important and important insight that came out of the press conference is We mentioned that the production sharing agreement, the new one that's going to be used for these additional oil blocks that are being auctioned, that has not been released. You hear a little find something here, a little something there, but that's not been released for consultation. While at the same time, this oil block auction keeps getting pushed back, and there, it seems to be a bit of confusion by the PEP there. So then, it now raises the question: why are we not seeing this particular PSA ventilated in the public? Why are we not seeing that? We believe that this PSA must be released so that it can be ventilated in public, so that we have an idea of what the government is going to do, and so that there can be national buy-in as to this new PSA. That is vital. And we in the opposition have put together our thoughts regarding what we think this new PSA or new agreement should look like. So we must recognize that circumstances have changed. We've got a situation where we've now got, I believe, in excess of 30 finds in the Stabroek block. So clearly there's oil out there. Clearly, and I don't know about you, but I don't think this is the last time they're going to find oil. So clearly there's quite a bit of oil out there. But we've also not seen the institutions developed to properly monitor by the PEP. They've not developed properly the institutions to properly monitor the oil and gas industry in the way that it needs to be monitored. Things like auditing and so on. They even allowed the audit to lapse recently, and then they had to ask Exxon for the capacity to go and audit those costs. So we've seen all of that happen, and not seeing robust structures built out to deal with the issues, especially auditing environmental issues and so on. We've not seen PEP do that. So we've still got a lot of the problems, but now we know that we have oil, and a huge amount of oil. This implies, viewers, that we need to take a long, hard look at the PSC that we're going to be using going forward. We need to have a thorough discussion around that PSC. And I know that there are many folks who have spoken about the last PSC and they have their views. I'm sure many of their views are genuine. But it would make their views seem even more genuine if they put a lot of energy towards attacking the issue of the upcoming PSA. Because it would make no sense that we express concerns about the existing production sharing agreement. And when a new one is being set up, no energy goes towards that particular PSA being reviewed the way it should be reviewed. That would make no sense. So we're going to go and do something that's going to cause questions once more. That's not acceptable. We need to have a better public discussion. We need to recognize the changed circumstances, because now Guyana's got all of these oil finds. It's a very different environment, and we need to adjust our thinking accordingly. But that's not going to happen if everything is handled behind closed doors. That's not going to happen. That is not how this issue should be addressed. Not at all how this issue should be addressed. So we're calling for the release of that PSA. Now that we kind of changed gears, let's bring up a couple of those slides that I mentioned. Let's bring up the one. There you go. You've got a house that's for sale. Over there, 180 million. 180 million. That is no small change. A 3-bedroom. I believe it has some office space, but still, 180 million for a 3-bedroom. That's a very significant price. That's about 900,000 US. Huge numbers, huge amounts. But this is what we've been referring to. This is what we've been referring to as we talk about the changes to the oil and gas industry, the changes to Guyana's economy brought about by the oil and gas industry, the changes to the real estate market brought about by the oil and gas industry. It's not abstract changes. They're seeing these things across the country. Seeing them across the country. $180 million. I believe I saw a property over on the West Bank for $80 million. Very high price for something all the way over there. Now, the reason that I want to bring this up is to give you a sense as we head into the video that this is really what happens in these types of economies. And it's not particularly unique to Guyana. So it's something that we have to keep at the back of our mind. Let's get the next slide up, which is just kind of furthers the point. So we've seen Houston Towers, we've seen some residents say that they're not interested in this development. It's a major development, supposed to provide high-end housing for the oil and gas industry and for others and so on. Again, keep this in mind because this will be featured in the video, this type of high-end housing, this type of high-end housing. So that again is something that is brewing, and we've seen 70 applications for such high-rise and similar high-quality buildings across Georgetown. 70 applications, Georgetown Region 4. So quite a bit of applications we've seen. Now, given that we've seen that, you have to ask yourself, how will the skyline of Georgetown be transformed? How will it be transformed? And the way that it will be transformed will hopefully be brought out over the course of the video and the discussions therein. But I want you to have that in the back of your mind. All right, well, we were seeing all these developments, but what will it do to the skyline of Georgetown? And what impact will it have on the people of Georgetown? And you see so much change, brought about by a growing industry. So that's what we want you to get a sense of. Let's get the first few minutes of the video going, and then we'll have a quick chat.
Center of a maze of dirt roads, shanty towns, crumbling infrastructure, open sewers, and trash fires, Central Luanda, circa 2015, was defined by opulence. 3 times a week, a specially configured 747 would speed 14 hours across the Atlantic from Houston, depositing up to 189 passengers at Angola's International Airport, an unusually low number for this aircraft, reflecting its unusually luxurious interior. 10 first-class seats, 143 business, and just 36 in economy. The Houston Express, as it was dubbed, operated as a charter accessible only to invitees of Angola's national oil company, the Sonangol Group, and for the convenience of a non-stop flight to or from America's oil capital, they charged an eye-popping $2,399 for a round-trip economy class ticket, roughly equivalent to half a year of income for the average Angolan. But these passengers were rarely Angolan. Rather, American oil executives, business people, and their families filled the 189 seats, returning from a visit to their home offices or hometowns. Having cleared customs, most would instruct their taxis to turn left or south towards their gated community of choice in the polished Talatona neighborhood. Inside these walls, snaking streets dotted by Range Rovers, BMWs, and Porsches opened up to suburban-style housing, featuring manicured lawns, backyard pools, tennis courts, backup generators, water treatment systems, and 24/7 security. An approximate impression of average American housing offered for a far higher than average $10,000 or $20,000 American dollars a month. Come evening, Talatona's residents might head to dinner at Café Del Mar, Pim's, Unda, or even the city's yacht club, a walled enclave of luxury carved out of a landscape of tin-roofed shacks. Regardless of the restaurant of choice, one couldn't escape for less than $100 a head. On a budget-conscious night, one could head to KFC, but still a meal there went for some $20 a person.
Find out a couple of important things to have in the back of your mind. The first is there's mention of a national oil company. All right, remember we've talked on this show about the dangers surrounding a national oil company. So it already started off there. The next is there's talk about expensive flights and so on. One of the things that's one of the reasons that it's important that we audit Exxon's costs is to identify whether or not, of course we don't know, but to identify whether or not there's been excessive spending on luxury flying around and these types of things that the Guyanese taxpayer really would have been losing out, where Guyanese taxpayers would be losing out because of these, because we have to pay for when its costs recovered, because we have to pay for these expensive trips and so on. So that's another thing that I wanted to note. It's one of the real concerns that we've got in Guyana that's reflected already when you look at the situation in Angola. And the third thing that I wanted to point out is we've talked about the neighborhoods that the oil and gas folks want to live in. We talked about that. We talked about the type of amenities they want. They want to have these kind of nice houses with hot and cold water and air conditioning, that it's a pool and so on. And we've talked about the prices. And the prices there are very similar because we've talked about houses that are $5,000 a month and $10,000 a month. And that $10,000 a month number is exactly what came up in that same few minutes of the video. So it is not that what is going on in Guyana is unique, but rather that this is what you see in a lot of countries when the oil and gas industry starts to kick off. And it is partly because those who work in the industry, especially foreign folks, want to live within safe environments, but also with a certain standard of living. This means that they only live in small, specific areas. And that is what has caused the jump in housing prices in Guyana, where the Private City Commission has said that housing prices have tripled in certain areas. Rental prices have tripled in certain areas. So this is really the same thing you see mirrored in Angola. You're seeing exactly the same effects in Angola. And I just wanted you to draw that to your attention so that you get a sense that it is not just here, but everywhere that these things really jump forward. Another thing that was mentioned was the high cost of food. KFC by itself costing you a lot of money. We've already seen concerns that the price of even basic things like fast food and so on has gone up around the country. So again, you're kind of seeing a very similar situation as the economy changes. So these are things to keep closely in mind. Let's get the video back up as we continue the discussion tonight, viewers.
Home cooking was also an option, but the comforts of home would cost you. A liter of Coke went for $10, while a pint of Haagen-Dazs $17. While the adults of Talatona would typically commute into downtown Luanda to work in some of the most expensive office space in the world, their kids would typically stay closer to home to attend the Luanda International School. English language, American accredited international baccalaureate curriculum was taught by an international collection of teachers in a sprawling, modern, polished campus. Tuition averaged some $50,000 a year, equivalent to 11 Angolans' average annual income, but it was often paid by the pupils' parents' employers, as it was the only school in the city to regularly send graduates to Stanford, Columbia, and Oxford. The wealth of the Luanda elite was, simply put, extraordinary. And so too were the means by which Luanda got to this point. Until recently, Luanda was less a destination for the world's elite, and more so a destination for deadly military ordnance. Entering the 1970s, even at the height of decolonization, it would have been hard to imagine Luanda as the capital of a single sovereign Angola. Entering this century, Luanda would have seemed one of the least likely of African capitals to have its downtown dotted with high-end hotels and streets crisscrossed by BMWs and Porsches. The bloody, drawn-out process of Angolan independence began in earnest here. On January 4th, 1961, where a protest over farm wages devolved into violence that spread across northern Angola before a brutal Portuguese response stopped the rebellion in its tracks. The months-long revolt signaled the upswelling of a nascent Angolan nationalism, while its violent conclusion hinted at the uphill battle such a movement would face going forward. In the years that followed this first rural revolt, a series of independence movements took shape across Angola. The FNLA, the main combatant group in 1961, formed in the north and coalesced around a shared Bakongo ethnicity. Around Luanda came the MPLA, a Marxist-Leninist group made up largely of Angolan intelligentsia. And in central Angola was UNITA, a group of FNLA dissidents who rallied around their Uvumbundu ethnic background. For the next decade, each group took on Portuguese military and Portuguese-funded paramilitaries. Because of such stark ideological and ethnic divides, though, each group did so individually, and each, in turn, failed. By 1974, Portuguese forces had pushed each of these factions to the very brink. Then, unexpectedly, Portugal itself fell in a military coup, and with the old regime went any interest in maintaining the nation's African colonies. After 400 years, Angola's colonial period was suddenly coming to a close. The ethnic and ideological divides that had fragmented their independence movement, however, weren't going anywhere.
Okay, viewers, so we close off that segment there with an interesting statement. The ethnic divides that had been part of their colonial, their struggle for independence weren't going anywhere. Does that sound familiar to you? So we've got a long history of ethnic tension in Guyana, and it has been very unfortunate and undermined Guyana's development. So similarly, you're seeing kind of a parallel here. You've also seen them mention that there were some, communist elements and so on within the various groups that were vying for independence. Similarly, we've had communist groups in Guyana, and that has raised serious questions about its effect on Guyana's development. Of course, being close to the U.S., that created great tension with the U.S. and has led to all sorts of problems over the years between Guyanese and the US. So that's something to keep at the back of your mind as well. But we also saw at the beginning of the video a bit of talk about inequality in Angola, a bit of talk about inequality. Some folks are saying there's children to the best possible private schools and so on, and they're becoming vastly wealthy. We've mentioned before on this show that in order for you to afford a house that's going to be $5,000 a month, as some folks are affording, you have to be making really about $15,000 a month, which is 3 million Guyana dollars. So that is not chump change. We've also talked in this show about the way that the Guyanese stock market has gone up 5 times over, and some people are 5 times richer than they were. So you can kind of see again this inequality beginning to play out in Guyana society, just as it began to play out in the Angolan society. The next segment of the video will give you a sense of some of the consequences or of the direction of change that these first few threads, which unfortunately are very similar to the threads that we've got in Guyana, have developed. Well, as we go along, we'll kind of give you an insight as to what we need to do to ensure that we don't end up in the same situation that the Angolans found themselves. So let's get the rest of the video up again.
40 years before it was known for the luxurious oil-funded Houston Express service, Luanda's airport appeared in the media as a chaotic, miserably crowded departure point for some 200,000 Portuguese Angolans fleeing from an impending war. Just months later, on the eve of Angola's official independence, the decision to leave proved prudent as the MPLA rushed the capital, pushed the FNLA out of Luanda, and named the nation's new president, Agostinho Neto. It was the first major move of what would be a decades-long civil war. From the start, the war took on an international bent as thousands of Cuban soldiers and 2 Yugoslavian warships bolstered the Marxist-Leninist hold over the capital, while South Africa, Zaire, and through covert funding the US, all backed the now allied FNLA and UNITA. A hotspot in the Cold War, Angolan territory flipped between UNITA and MPLA forces practically every battle, every offensive, and every year, as aid from various world powers bolstered both parties' ability to keep fighting. Between the occasional ceasefire or failed negotiation, the war carried through the 70s and 80s. Without either side able to claim a defensive victory, it stretched into the 90s. As the Cold War closed, Angola's civil war lost its ideological edge and international appeal. Angola's president, José Eduardo dos Santos, who had led the MPLA government since Neto's death in 1979, liberalized much of the Angolan economy, while UNITA carried on without the money from the West, instead funding their war efforts through the diamond trade. In 2002, with the assassination of its longtime leader, with increasingly tight sanctions on its diamond trade, and without a real cause to fight for, UNITA entered peace talks. After nearly 30 years, the Angolan Civil War came sputtering to a close, accomplishing remarkably little. The same party remained in power, the same president remained in office, while a third of the nation's population had now been internally displaced, 2/3 didn't have access to running water, and life expectancy hovered in the 40s. Late to gain its independence and mired by 3 decades of ruthless civil war, 21st century Angola was desperately behind. Now, for as long as Angola's been a country, it's been an oil economy. In fact, by the time the Civil War ended, Angola was nearing its 100th anniversary of commercial oil production. Even during the war, as landmines littered the countryside and deadly violence occurred daily, international oil giants like Shell and Chevron braved the conditions on account of the profit opportunity Angola afforded. Onshore oil fields were frequently attacked and destroyed, but much of the country's oil was located offshore, beneath hundreds or thousands of feet of ocean. So, focus gravitated offshore, where the liquid gold could be extracted in relative safety throughout the conflict. Ironically, however, the oil industry itself prolonged their biggest obstacle to increase production as they funded the MPLA's war machine through the drilling fees they paid them. But when the war finally ended, when peace was found, that obstacle was removed. Without the civil war necessitating burdensome security contractors and expensive hardship wages, oil production in Angola immediately grew far cheaper and far easier. Profiteers the world over jumped on the opportunity. Sonangol and its international partners planned for new rigs and expanded operations, which came at the perfect time as the West, and especially America, looked to distance itself from Middle Eastern oil in the wake of 9/11. President Dos Santos was even invited by Bush to the Oval Office to discuss that very subject. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, China also identified the opportunity. Just months after the war officially ended, it signed a $2 billion loan agreement with Angola, using its future oil production as collateral, positioning the country in a strategic tug-of-war between two of the world's great powers.
All right, folks. So again, another interesting snippet. What I think is really, again, so insightful, so very much mirrors what's going on in Guyana is this question of the various countries in the world scrambling for oil reserves. And we've seen, because of the war in Ukraine and sanctions on Russia and the impending additional sanctions, that there is a bit of a scramble to find oil and natural gas reserves to compensate for what is missing, what would be reduced if Russia is taken completely off of Europeans, the European supply infrastructure. So similarly, you're seeing people scrambling and coming into the country, and this is the context behind the oil block auction here in Guyana, and the context behind the high oil price over the course of this year. Now, we will recall that the expected oil price for the year was $75 a barrel, but rather we've had an oil price that has been $100 a barrel or higher than that for a prolonged period of time, pretty much the entire year, give or take. And so you can kind of see that the same circumstances are shaping up. But the question is, will it lead to something positive or something negative? And that is where we can hopefully learn some lessons from what happened in Angola that we can instead apply here in Guyana. Fortunately, we haven't had a civil war the way that they had civil wars, but we've still had a lot of ethnic tension over the years, which has led to, I think, really made it difficult for Guyana to develop as quickly as it would really have. We would all have liked Guyana to really develop. Let's jump back into the video there, viewers.
Within 3 short years, the post-war economy was kicking into high gear. 2005's oil production figures were already double those of the Civil War era, and the country recorded its highest GDP jump in history. The economy expanded some 15% in just 12 months. Soon after, Angola overtook Saudi Arabia to become China's largest oil provider, while the country's first shopping mall opened in the center of the quickly developing, upscale Talatona neighborhood. Angola's position as a new oil giant was solidified as it joined the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, a global price-fixing cartel including Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others. By the 2010s, Luanda's skyline had been thoroughly transformed. Glass-fronted skyscrapers stretched hundreds of feet into the sky, filled with modern apartments selling for millions or tens of millions of dollars. 5-star hotels now offered visiting executives accommodations on par with those in Houston, Calgary, Abu Dhabi, or the other oil capitals of the world. Even the global financial crisis barely shook Luanda from its path. As the global economy shrank, Angola still eked out growth. It was one of the fastest growing, fastest developing, fastest changing countries in the world. Others had experienced oil booms, but none went from civil war to helipad-laden $10 million penthouse apartments in less than a decade. Some asked if Luanda was on track to become the Dubai of Africa, a place that, just a few more years into the future, would have Lamborghinis on every block, 5-star hotels from every international brand, and Michelin-starred restaurants from all the globe's best chefs. Others, however, started asking a different question. What had this boom done for everyone else? Including the expats and oil executives and politicians and business people, how had life changed for the everyday Angolan, the other 99.5% of the country? Well, between 2002 and 2010, Angola's economy grew 534%, but, of course, GDP is not a useful metric for assessing the quality of life of the everyday person. What is the Human Development Index, which combines metrics related to health, education, and standard of living into a composite score. Angola's in 2002 was 0.426 out of 1. By 2010, it was 0.517. It had jumped more than 20%. But so did the rest of the world's. Looking relatively, Angola ranked 154th in the world for HDI in 2002. In 2010, it ranked higher, by 4 places. That's to say, the economy was now $66 billion larger, but somehow, the everyday Angolan was doing just about the same. This was baffling and an embarrassment for the country's triumphant leadership. When the United Nations Development Program released data indicating that just 19% of men and 15% of women in the country attained a high school level education, the government disputed the figures, saying the UN had an incorrect methodology. But the embarrassments kept stacking. The facade started to fall. 2010 was supposed to be a watershed year for Angola as it hosted the Africa Cup of Nations, the 3rd largest soccer tournament in existence. It was supposed to be the clearest indication yet that Angola was safe, developed, and open to the world, but in the days leading up to its start, as Togo's national team traveled to their opening match, separatists gunned down their bus as it passed through Cabinda, killing 3 of their traveling party. This incident cast a dark shadow on the typically jubilant tournament and was positioned in international media as an indicator that, despite all the pomp and circumstance of the new Luanda, deep down, Angola was still the same underdeveloped, impoverished, violent country of a decade before. For a decade, the success stories drowned out failures, but failures began to mount, and as they did, they became harder to ignore.
Yes, viewers. So I know that there's probably 1 or 2 things here that you found that were pretty similar to what we're seeing in Guyana. First of all, a very rapid rise in GDP, a very rapid rise in the oil industry, a massive development in that respect. But the question of whether the average Guyanese is benefiting from this, and that's a very, very serious, very alarming question that we face right now. So similarly in Angola, you saw as much as all this money is being made, not much progress in terms of people's standards of living, in terms of people's education, and so on and so forth. And we in the PNCR have recognized that this is a serious issue. And as a result, we've put forward policies that will almost eliminate the dropping out that we see with students, that will focus students on training to get into the oil and gas industry, training to get into other industries where they can earn a high wage, and that will help to really push the country forward. So we've recognized that this is a problem that many other countries have faced. Oil, as we've said on this show before, is a funny man, and it can make things better, it can make things worse. It's possible for either outcome to happen. What happened in Angola is that as much as things got a little bit better, didn't get particularly better. The economy expanded in only a few years, 500 and something percent, but people's standards of living barely moved up. The ranking in terms of countries barely moved up. We don't want that to happen in Guyana, but that is the direction that we're heading already. That's the direction we're heading already. Don't believe me? Ask yourself, in the last supplemental budget, was there anything there to help people deal with the cost of living crisis? No. Hardly anything there. And as a result of that, you can already see that the money is being directed away from the people. PUP is directing the money away from the people and towards their own ends. So that is something to keep in mind. That is something to keep in mind. Let's go back to the video, viewers, because it's not done. It looks bad, but it's gonna get worse.
Enclave of luxury carved out of a landscape of tin-roofed shacks. Regardless of the restaurant of choice, one couldn't escape China's largest oil provider, while the country's first shopping mall, the government disputed the figures, saying the UN had an incorrect methodology. But the embarrassments kept stacking. the facade started to fall. 2010 was supposed to be a watershed year for Angola as it hosted the Africa Cup of Nations, the third largest soccer tournament in existence. It was supposed to be the clearest indication yet that Angola was safe, developed, and open to the world, but in the days leading up to its start, failures began to mount, and as they did, they became harder to ignore. 2012 brought coverage of what was believed to be the most expensive apartment sale on the African continent to date in Luanda. But acknowledging the difficulty the real estate boom presented to housing everyone else, Dos Santos had promised in his 2008 presidential campaign to build 1 million homes by 2012. In 2012, however, even the pared-down post-election version of this promise faltered. The first 2,800 apartments went up for sale in the brand new Calamba neighborhood, which would eventually have capacity for 200,000 working-class residents. But 6 months in, just 220 of those homes had been sold due to the fact that the very working-class residents they were built for couldn't afford or finance them. But the next year, Angola was celebrated the world over as Isabel dos Santos, the president's daughter, had become the first African woman ever to make the Forbes billionaires list with an estimated net worth north of $3 billion. It wasn't South Africa or Nigeria or any of the continent's other traditional centers of wealth to earn this honor, but rather tiny, scrappy Angola. Dos Santos owned significant stakes in banks, media companies, and cell providers in Angola and Portugal, a home on the private island of the exclusive Bulgari resort in Dubai, a $16 million home in the affluent Kensington neighborhood of London, a comparatively modest $1.8 million penthouse apartment in Lisbon, a $55 million villa just steps away from the Casino de Monte Carlo in Monaco, and to go with it, a $35 million, 50-meter, 164-foot yacht anchored in the Mediterranean below. And in 2016, her fortunes, both literal and figurative, only increased as her father fired the entire board of Sonangol, Angola's national oil company, and replaced it with a sole chairwoman, Isabel dos Santos herself. She was now in charge of the most powerful company in the country, making her perhaps the country's second most powerful person after her father himself. However, just months earlier, he had announced his imminent retirement. Jose Eduardo dos Santos would pass the torch, and Angola would have a new president for the first time in 38 years. The president and his party planned for longtime MPLA politician João Lourenço to take the reins, which he did on September 26, 2017. But then things went less to plan. Isabel dos Santos was quickly fired from her leading position at Sonangol, while her half-brother, who had been leading the country's sovereign wealth fund, was arrested on corruption and money laundering charges. Out of nowhere, João Lourenço turned on the Dos Santos family and asked the question no powerful MPLA leader had ever dared. Was it merely a coincidence that Africa's wealthiest woman was the daughter of Angola's most powerful man, or was something more nefarious going on? Quietly, this question had been circling around the international business community for years, and by the mid-2010s, some were formulating informed opinions. Western banks like Citigroup and Barclays backed out of deals with the businesswoman, Intertrust and ING closed accounts linked to her and her husband, and Sonangol officials rallied against Dos Santos' alleged mismanagement of funds. For her part, Dos Santos pushed back, arguing that claims of illegality were unfounded and that the banks had anti-African biases. Then, in 2020, as rumors swirled, accusations mounted, and investigations dug deeper, the world was offered its clearest view yet into Dos Santos' business dealings through a landslide of private documents called the Luanda Leaks. Captured by a notorious Portuguese whistleblower, passed to the Paris-based platform to protect whistleblowers in Africa, then analyzed and disseminated by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the 715,000 leaked memos, emails, contracts, and meeting minutes corroborated many of the suspicions and outright accusations lobbed at the former president's daughter. At practically every turn in her empire-building career, the documents showed, Isabel dos Santos benefited from insider deal-making that landed her one massive government contract after the next. In 1999, there was the brand new mobile phone company Unitel, of which she owned a 25% share, being granted a valuable telecoms license by the government.
All right, viewers, as we wrap up tonight, I wondered if it was obvious to you what I would say, but Isabel dos Santos is a family member of the former president. We have said that the PPP is just interested in helping friends and the family members. So you can see that there's a little bit of a link that's going up here. And don't take our word for it. In the press conference today, we mentioned that Jack Deal himself said, Sue is my friend. He gets all the support. In this video here, we're seeing, of course, that, we want to see investigations of the allegations into corruption, rampant corruption and bribery that the vice president faces to see the truth. But in another country, we've seen some similarities with that country. In another country, we are seeing the president's daughter family getting lots of business deals and contracts, and some would say support. So, of course, she has denied that she was involved in corruption. She denied being involved in that. Um, we would like to see investigations in Guyana regarding what Sue has said so that we know what the truth is, because this is incredibly alarming. But what the lesson that we want to really learn coming out of Angola is when we leave our oil resources and our governance in the hands of just a few elites, and we don't have the kind of accountability and transparency and openness and thoughtfulness that is necessary, what can happen is that a few elites can become incredibly wealthy and the broader population not benefit from the massive oil resources that you're seeing, the massive resources. And you may say, how can this be that all of this money can go to waste and so on? But when you see projects double in cost, as we've seen already, when you see projects like Amalia Falls continue, even though so many people have said that it makes no sense to pursue the project, you see that, you have to ask yourself, if this is the type of management that we expect to see of the revenues, and whether that means that, this is of course the concern in the future, whether that means that the PUP is going to be enriching its friends and family. Is that what the PUP is going to be doing? And if that is indeed the case, what does that say about Guyana's future? So we have seen in another African, in an African country, we have seen the prospect, a bright prospect of growth and advancement, revenues, massive expansion in GDP, very nice areas in the country developed, many people making money, but we've not seen progress the way that people expected to see progress. There's talk even in those videos about Lamborghinis and Porsches and so on. And you're starting to see around Georgetown, I don't know if you noticed, starting to see the odd Porsche, some Benz, some BMWs, high end, around the place, starting to pick up on it. It's gonna come, and it's gonna come across the entire city. It's just a matter of time. That is what you're starting to see. But we don't want to see the other side of this, which is where, because of massive corruption, the average person does not benefit. That's the real concern. And that's why we have to take the insights from Angola, take the insights from the questions that we've had around a national oil company that Angola has, the president's daughter was heading up. And we have to say to ourselves, listen, we recognize the mistakes and the risks that other countries have made. We recognize the problems that other countries have had, and we don't intend to have those problems here. So when we hear the government talk about a national oil company, this is why it raises a real concern. I'm sure Isabel dos Santos will make every effort to defend herself, but it does raise a lot of concerns, and it, I think, sends a message to us on the other side of the Atlantic that we have to keep in our minds the experiences and the difficulties that other countries in our similar situation have had. Viewers, I want to say thank you for joining me as always. Thank you for joining me on the Lowdown. You know that it's always an interesting opportunity to chat with you. We always like to have a hopefully insightful, informative, and interesting discussions. Today we talked quite a bit about Angola. We talked about the press conference. We talked about cost of living. We talked about the oil blocks and so on. And all of these things are linked, viewers. All of these things are so linked. So thank you very much for tuning into the Lowdown, and we'll catch you on Saturday night.
Thank you for watching our program. See you right back here, same place, same time. And remember, hold the line of battle, comrades. Our victory is sure.